The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that week. 23 years of service had taught him that perfection was not just expected, it was demanded. Every button gleaming, every crease razor-sharp, every movement precise. The Queen's Guard stood as living symbols of unwavering discipline and absolute protocol. James had joined the Grenadier Guards straight from a council estate in Manchester, where his mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. The military had given him structure, purpose, and eventually, the highest honor a British soldier could achieve, protecting the royal family. His colleagues often joked that James could recite the Guard manual in his sleep, and they weren't far wrong. On this particular Tuesday, tourists were already gathering behind the gates, cameras ready to capture the famous guards who never smiled, never moved, never broke character. James took his position at the palace entrance, his bearskin hat adding nearly 2 feet to his already impressive height. The familiar weight of his rifle felt reassuring against his shoulder as he settled into the rigid stance that would define his next 2 hours. The first hour passed uneventfully. Tourists snapped photos, children waved enthusiastically, and a few brave souls tried to make him laugh with silly faces and jokes. James remained stone-faced, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance just as he had been trained. Protocol was everything. The reputation of the Guard depended on their unwavering composure. Then she appeared, a small girl, perhaps 7 years old, broke away from her family group and approached the gate. She wore a bright yellow dress that seemed to capture the morning sunlight, and her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon that had come loose during her journey. But it was her eyes that caught James's attention. They were filled with tears, and her small shoulders shook with quiet sobs. The girl stood directly in front of James, no more than 10 feet away, separated only by the ornate palace railings. Her family hadn't noticed her departure yet. They were busy taking selfies near the Victoria Memorial. The child pressed her face against the cold metal bars and whispered something James couldn't quite hear. Over the distant traffic and tourist chatter, every instinct James had developed over 2 decades of military service screamed at him to maintain position, to ignore the distraction, to uphold the sacred trust placed in the Queen's Guard. The training was absolute. Nothing, absolutely nothing, should break their composure or draw them from their duty. He had seen guards disciplined for far less than acknowledging a civilian during duty hours. But something about this little girl tugged at his heart, in a way that caught him completely off guard. Perhaps it was the way she clutched a small stuffed elephant to her chest, or how she kept looking back toward her family with such obvious distress. Her quiet crying wasn't the performative tantrum of a spoiled child demanding attention. This was genuine fear, real anxiety that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. James fought an internal battle that felt more challenging than any he had faced in his military career. His mind raced through the consequences of breaking protocol. There would be disciplinary action, possible demotion, maybe even dismissal from the Guard. His commanding officers had made it clear that maintaining the mystique and dignity of the Queen's Guard was paramount. They were not entertainers, not babysitters, not social workers. They were soldiers with one sacred duty. Yet as he watched the girl wipe her eyes with the back of her small hand, James felt something shift inside him. Beneath the red tunic, the ceremonial regalia, and the weight of tradition, he was still human. He was still the boy from Manchester whose own mother had once comforted him when he was scared, and alone in a world that seemed too big and too frightening to navigate. The girl looked up at him again, and this time James caught her whispered words. "Please, can you help me find my mummy?" The simple request, delivered with such trust and hope, nearly broke his resolve entirely. She believed in him, in the uniform, in what he represented. To her, he wasn't just a tourist attraction or a symbol of imperial power. He was safety, authority, someone who could make things right in her small world that had suddenly gone wrong. James' training warred with his compassion. He could see her family still clustered around the memorial, completely unaware that their daughter had wandered off. The girl was clearly lost, clearly frightened, and clearly looking to him for help. Every fiber of his being as a protector, as a human being, urged him to act. But the weight of his responsibility to the crown, to his fellow guards, to the centuries of tradition he represented, held him frozen in place. The Queen's Guard did not break protocol. The Queen's Guard did not acknowledge civilians. The Queen's Guard maintained their post no matter what happened around them. The girl's tears began to fall more freely now, and she pressed herself closer to the railings, her small fingers wrapping around the metal bars as if trying to reach him. "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible above the growing crowd of tourists who had begun to notice the interaction. James felt the eyes of tourists turning toward them, cameras beginning to focus on this unexpected scene. Some visitors seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though they couldn't have understood the magnitude of the moment for the guard himself. This wasn't just about helping a lost child. This was about choosing between duty and compassion, between protocol and humanity. The seconds stretched like hours as James stood frozen between two worlds, the rigid demands of his military service and the simple human need to help a frightened child. In that moment, 23 years of training, discipline, and unwavering adherence to protocol hung in the balance against the tear-stained face of a little girl who believed he could save her day. The decision he made in the next few moments would change not only his own life but challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and what it truly meant to serve. James Mitchell's world narrowed to a single point of focus: the frightened child before him, whose quiet sobs were becoming harder to ignore with each passing second. The morning breeze rustled through the trees in St. James's Park, carrying with it the distant sounds of London awakening. But all James could hear was the soft whimpering of a lost little girl who had placed her faith in him. The internal struggle felt like it might tear him in two. On one side stood everything he had built his adult life around: military precision, unwavering duty, the sacred trust of protecting the monarchy. On the other side was something far more primal and immediate: a child in distress who needed help. James had never married, never had children of his own. But something about this moment awakened every protective instinct he possessed. He glanced sideways, careful not to move his head, and caught sight of his fellow guard, Corporal Davies, stationed about 50 meters away. Davies was younger, only 3 years into his service, but he possessed the same rigid adherence to protocol that had been drilled into every member of the guard. If Davies noticed what was happening, he gave no sign. His eyes remained fixed, straight ahead, his posture perfect, his face expressionless beneath his bearskin hat. The tourists were definitely watching now. James could sense their collective attention like a physical weight. Some had their phones out, others whispered among themselves, and a few seemed to be waiting with bated breath to see what the famous stoic guard would do. The girl remained, pressed against the railings, her small face streaked with tears, looking up at him with such complete trust that it made his chest tighten. Then, making a decision that would haunt his dreams and define his character for years to come, James did something unprecedented in his 23 years of service. Moving with the same precision he brought to every military maneuver, he took one single step to his left, just enough to position himself directly in front of the child. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible to most observers. But to James it felt like crossing a canyon. He had broken formation. He had acknowledged a civilian during duty. He had violated protocol in the most fundamental way possible. Yet as he looked down at the little girl's upturned face, he felt no regret, only a deep sense that this was exactly what he was supposed to do in this moment. The girl's eyes widened with hope as she realized he was looking at her, really looking at her, not through her or past her as he had been trained to do with all civilians. "Are you going to help me?" she whispered, pressing her face closer to the bars. James knew he couldn't speak. That would be a violation too far, even for this unprecedented situation. But he could communicate in other ways. Moving with deliberate slowness, he shifted his rifle from his right shoulder to his left, then extended his right hand toward the child. His white glove touched the metal bars just inches from her small fingers. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. The girl understood immediately, reaching up to touch the bars near his hand. Though they couldn't actually touch through the ornate metalwork, the connection was real and immediate. "Thank you," she whispered, her tears beginning to slow. James used his eyes to communicate what his voice could not. He looked at the girl, then toward her family near the Victoria Memorial, then back at her. He repeated this several times until she followed his gaze and spotted her parents and older brother clustered around the monument, completely absorbed in their photography session. "They don't know I'm gone," the girl said softly, understanding, flooding her young face. "I saw you and wanted to say hello, but then I couldn't find them again." James nodded almost imperceptibly, then used his eyes to trace a path from where they stood back to her family. The route was clear and safe, but he could see why a 7-year-old might find it overwhelming. The crowds had thickened since the morning began, and from a child's perspective, the sea of adult legs and tourist groups would seem like an impossible maze. What happened next would become the stuff of legend among the palace staff, though different witnesses would remember it, slightly differently over the years. James, still maintaining his post but now fully committed to helping this child, began what could only be described as the most dignified escort mission of his career. Using only eye contact and subtle gestures, he guided the girl along the fence line toward her family. When she moved too quickly and risked losing sight of him, he would shift his weight slightly, a signal for her to slow down. When she hesitated, uncertain of the direction, he would look pointedly toward the next landmark she needed to navigate, toward. The tourists who witnessed this unprecedented interaction fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Cameras captured the moment from every angle, but there was a reverence in their silence that spoke to the gravity of what was unfolding. This wasn't entertainment. This was humanity triumphing over protocol in the most dignified way possible. Step by step, James walked the girl back toward her family while never leaving his post. It was an impossible feat of communication and coordination that required both participants to be completely attuned to each other. The child, for her part, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and moved with careful precision, following his guidance exactly. When they were about halfway to her destination, the girl's mother finally looked up from her camera and realized her daughter was missing. The panic that crossed her face was immediate and visible from 100 yards away. She grabbed her husband's arm and pointed frantically in different directions, her voice carrying across the courtyard as she called her daughter's name. The little girl heard her mother's voice and instinctively started to run toward the sound, but James caught her attention with a slight movement of his hand. His message was clear: stay calm, stay safe, let them see you. The wisdom of his guidance became apparent immediately as the girl's mother spotted her near the palace gates and came running, relief flooding her features. The reunion was emotional and beautiful, with the mother scooping her daughter into her arms and holding her tightly while the father looked on with visible relief. But what happened next surprised everyone, including James himself. Instead of hurrying away, embarrassed by the incident, the family approached the fence where James stood. The mother, still holding her daughter, looked up at James with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how you helped her, but I can see that you did. Thank you for taking care of our little girl." The father nodded his agreement, while the older brother looked at James with obvious awe. But it was the little girl's response that affected James most deeply. She wriggled in her mother's arms until she could see him clearly, then pressed her small hand against the fence and said, "You're the kindest soldier in the whole world." James felt his eyes begin to burn with unshed tears, but his training held firm. He couldn't respond verbally, couldn't break character completely, but he could acknowledge her words. In the slightest of movements, he inclined his head toward the child, a gesture so subtle that only she and her family would recognize it as the profound thank you it was meant to be. Word of James Mitchell's act of compassion spread through the palace faster than morning mist dissipates in sunlight. By the time his shift ended 3 hours later, every guard, every palace staff member, and several ranking officers had heard various versions of what had transpired at the gates. Some accounts were wildly exaggerated, claiming he had left his post entirely to escort the child. Others were more accurate, but still emphasized the unprecedented nature of his actions. As James removed his bearskin hat and loosened his collar, in the guard quarters he felt the weight of every conversation that stopped when he entered a room, every sideways glance from his fellow soldiers, every whispered discussion that clearly centered on him. The mixture of admiration and concern in his colleagues' eyes told him everything he needed to know about the storm that was brewing. Corporal Davies approached him as he was cleaning his rifle, a task James performed with the same meticulous care he brought to everything else, but today his hands shook slightly as he worked. Davies was a good soldier, ambitious and eager to advance through the ranks, but he had always respected James's experience and reputation. "Sarge," Davies said quietly, settling onto the bench beside him. "Everyone's talking about what happened. Out there, some of the lads think you're a bloody hero. Others—" He trailed off, not wanting to voice the concerns that were undoubtedly circulating among the more protocol-minded guards. James continued cleaning his weapon, his movements precise despite his inner turmoil. "And what do you think, Davies?" The younger man was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I think," he said finally, "that little girl went home tonight, feeling safe because of what you did. And I think her parents will tell that story for the rest of their lives. But I also think Major Harrison is going to want to see you first thing tomorrow morning." James nodded grimly. Major Harrison was old-school military through and through, a man who had built his career on the foundation of absolute adherence to regulations. He had been known to discipline guards for infractions as minor as having a button slightly out of alignment or standing a degree off their prescribed angle. What James had done would be seen as nothing short of insubordination. That evening, James walked through his small flat in Westminster like a man preparing for battle. He pressed his dress uniform with extra care, polished his shoes until they gleamed like mirrors, and reviewed the regulations he had violated. The Queen's Guard manual was specific about maintaining position, about not acknowledging civilians during duty, about the importance of preserving the mystique and dignity of the Guard. But as he prepared for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of his military career, James found himself thinking not about regulations and protocols, but about the look of relief on that little girl's face when she had found her family. He thought about her mother's tears of gratitude, about the way the other tourists had watched the interaction with something approaching reverence rather than mere curiosity. Sleep eluded him that night. James lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying every second of those crucial moments when he had chosen compassion over protocol. He didn't regret his decision. That surprised him more than anything else. Despite knowing the consequences he would face, despite understanding that his actions had gone against everything he had been trained to believe was sacred about his duty, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. The next morning arrived, gray and drizzling, as if London itself was reflecting James's mood as he reported to Major Harrison's office. The Major was a lean, sharp-featured man whose own military career had been built on the principle that discipline was the foundation of everything worthwhile in life. His office walls were covered with commendations, photographs with senior, royals, and certificates that spoke to a lifetime of unwavering service. "Sergeant Mitchell," Major Harrison said without looking up from the paperwork spread across his desk, "please sit down." James took his seat in the rigid chair facing the Major's desk, his posture military perfect despite the circumstances. He had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his mind, but he knew that nothing could truly prepare him for what was about to unfold. "I've received several reports about your conduct yesterday," the Major continued, finally looking up to meet James's eyes. His expression was unreadable, a mask of professional neutrality that gave no hint of the storm or calm that might be brewing beneath the surface. "Would you care to explain your actions?" James had prepared a careful response, one that acknowledged his violation of protocol while emphasizing the unique circumstances that had prompted his decision. But as he opened his mouth to deliver his rehearsed explanation, he found himself saying something entirely different. "Sir, a child was lost and frightened. She needed help, and I was in a position to provide it without abandoning my post or compromising the security of the palace. I made a judgment call that I believed was consistent with the values that the guard represents, even if it wasn't consistent with the specific protocols we're required to follow. Major Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying James with the intensity of a man trying to solve a complex puzzle. Sergeant Mitchell, in your 23 years of service, have you ever violated protocol before yesterday? No, sir. Have you ever received disciplinary action for any reason? No, sir. Your service record is exemplary. Your fellow guards respect you, your superiors trust you, and you've been considered for promotion multiple times. Why would you risk all of that for one lost child? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. James understood that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but potentially influence how the guard would handle similar situations in the future. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. Sir, I joined the military to serve something bigger than myself. I became part of the Queen's Guard because I believed it represented the highest ideals of that service. Yesterday, I had to choose between following a rule and embodying those ideals. I chose to embody them. Major Harrison was quiet for so long that James began to wonder if he had completely destroyed his career with his honesty. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the Major drummed his fingers against his desk and stared out the rain-streaked window behind James's shoulder. You realize, the Major said finally, that if every guard decided to interpret their duties based on personal judgment rather than established protocol, we would have chaos. The entire system depends on predictability, on absolute adherence to established procedures. Yes, sir, I understand that. I also understand that what I did was unprecedented and cannot become commonplace. But I believe there are moments when rigid adherence to protocol serves no one, and this was one of those moments. What happened next would surprise James for years to come. Major Harrison opened his desk drawer and withdrew a folder that James hadn't noticed before. It was thick with papers, photographs, and what appeared to be printed emails. Sergeant Mitchell, the Major said, his tone shifting slightly. Since yesterday afternoon, this office has received 47 emails, 16 phone calls, and 12 formal letters regarding your actions. Would you like to guess the nature of these communications? James felt his stomach drop. He had expected consequences, but the idea that his actions had generated such a massive response filled him with dread. I assume they're complaints, sir. Major Harrison smiled for the first time since James had entered the office, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed his entire face. On the contrary, Sergeant, every single one of these communications is expressing gratitude, admiration, and support for what you did yesterday. We've received emails from around the world, from people who saw the videos and photographs that tourists posted online. Parents thanking you for showing their children that soldiers can be both strong and kind. Veterans expressing pride in your service. Even several members of Parliament have reached out to commend your actions. The revelation that James's actions had sparked worldwide admiration rather than condemnation left him speechless. Major Harrison continued flipping through the folder, pulling out printed photographs that tourists had shared online, showing the moment when James had guided the lost child back to her family. The images captured something that James hadn't fully realized at the time, the profound dignity with which he had managed to help while maintaining his post. This photograph, Major Harrison said, holding up a particularly striking image, has been shared over 2 million times on social media platforms. The caption reads, "This is what honor looks like, a soldier who serves with both strength and compassion." The photographer was an American tourist named Sarah Chen, and she sent a personal email describing how moved she was by witnessing your actions. James looked at the photograph and saw himself as others had seen him, not as a soldier breaking protocol, but as a human being making the right choice in difficult circumstances. The image showed the precise moment when the little girl had reached toward the fence while he had positioned his hand near hers, creating a connection that transcended the physical barrier between them. "Sir," James said quietly, "I need to ask, am I being disciplined for my actions?" Major Harrison set the photograph down and leaned forward, his expression growing serious again. "Sergeant Mitchell, what you did yesterday created a significant problem for this office. Not because of public reaction, which has been overwhelmingly positive, but because it forces us to confront a gap between our written protocols and our fundamental mission." The major stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the palace grounds where James had made his career-defining decision just 24 hours earlier. The Queen's Guard exists to protect the royal family and to represent the values of service, duty, and honor that define the British military. Yesterday, you represented those values perfectly, while simultaneously violating our operational protocols. James felt his future hanging in the balance as Major Harrison turned back to face him. After extensive consultation with senior leadership, including discussions that reached the highest levels of palace administration, we've reached a decision about how to handle this situation. The pause that followed felt eternal. James thought about his mother back in Manchester, who had always been so proud of his service with the Guard. He thought about the little girl who had trusted him to help her, and about the thousands of people around the world who had apparently seen something inspiring in his actions. Effective immediately, Major Harrison continued, "You're being reassigned to a new position. The palace is creating a special liaison role between the Guard and the public. Your responsibilities will include developing protocols for situations that require guards to interact with civilians in emergencies, training new recruits on balancing compassion with duty, and serving as a point of contact for special circumstances that may arise during public events." James struggled to process what he was hearing. Rather than being demoted or dismissed, he was being promoted to a position that had never existed before, one created specifically to address the gap his actions had revealed between rigid protocol and human need. "Sir, I don't understand. You're rewarding me for breaking protocol?" Major Harrison returned to his desk and picked up another document from the thick folder. 3 hours after the first photographs of your actions appeared online, we received a call from Clarence House. The Prince of Wales had seen the images and wanted to know more about the Guard who had shown such compassion while maintaining his dignity and post. The Major paused to let the significance of royal attention sink in before continuing. "His Royal Highness expressed his view that your actions represented the very best of what the monarchy stands for: service to others, particularly those who are vulnerable or in need. He specifically requested that we find ways to encourage this type of judgment and compassion among all guards, while still maintaining our essential protocols." James felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from expecting career-ending consequences to receiving royal endorsement for his actions. "There's more," Major Harrison said, his tone warming again. "The little girl you helped yesterday, her name is Emma Thompson, and her family is from Scotland. Her father wrote us a letter that I'd like you to hear." The Major cleared his throat and began reading from a handwritten note. "To the kind Guard who helped our daughter Emma yesterday. We cannot adequately express our gratitude for your kindness. Emma has been telling everyone she meets about the nice soldier who helped her find us when she was scared. She's decided she wants to be a soldier too when she grows up, because soldiers help people who need help. Thank you for showing our daughter and apparently the whole world that strength and kindness aren't opposites. They work together to make real heroes." James felt his eyes burning with unshed tears as the Major finished reading. The idea that his actions had inspired a young child to see soldiers as helpers rather than just symbols of authority touched something deep in his soul. "The Thompsons have asked if they might visit again and properly thank you in person," Major Harrison continued. "I told them that could certainly be arranged, though next time they'll need to keep better track of young Emma." Despite the emotional weight of the moment, both men chuckled at that. James was beginning to understand that his world hadn't ended the day before. It had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. "Your new role will begin next Monday," Major Harrison explained. "You'll retain your rank and receive additional training in public relations, crisis management, and protocol development. You'll also be working closely with child welfare experts to develop guidelines for situations involving lost or distressed children near palace grounds." James shook his head in amazement. "Sir, when I woke up this morning, I was certain my military career was over. I never imagined—" That following your conscience could lead to advancement rather than punishment, Major Harrison finished. Sergeant, the military and the monarchy has always been at its best when it adapts to serve the people rather than simply following traditions for their own sake. What you did yesterday reminded us all of why we serve in the first place. The beast Major opened his desk drawer again and withdrew a small official-looking envelope sealed with the palace crest. This arrived an hour ago. It's a personal note from Her Majesty, expressing her appreciation for your service and your compassion. I haven't read it. It's addressed to you personally, but I understand it includes an invitation for you and your mother to attend a private reception, recognizing exceptional service by palace staff and military personnel. James accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. The idea that his actions had reached the Queen herself seemed surreal. All his life he had served the crown as an abstract concept, a symbol of duty and tradition. Now, suddenly, that service had become personal and immediate. "Sir," James said, as he carefully tucked the royal correspondence into his jacket pocket, "what should I tell the other guards? How do I explain that breaking protocol led to promotion rather than punishment?" Major Harrison considered the question carefully. "You tell them the truth, Sergeant. You tell them that our protocols exist to help us serve effectively, not to prevent us from serving at all. You tell them that good judgment will always be valued alongside strict discipline. And you tell them that the best soldiers are those who understand when rules serve their purpose and when compassion serves a higher purpose." As James prepared to leave the office that had seemed so threatening an hour earlier, Major Harrison called after him. "Oh, and Sergeant, there's one more thing. The Guard Museum has requested the uniform you wore yesterday. They want to include it in an exhibit about the evolution of the Queen's Guard and our commitment to serving both crown and country with honor. Apparently, you've become part of history." 3 weeks after that transformative morning, James nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Your Majesty. We're creating what we're calling compassionate protocols, guidelines that allow guards to provide assistance in genuine emergencies while maintaining security and dignity. It's been fascinating work, actually. We're discovering that most situations can be handled without abandoning our posts if we're creative about how we communicate and coordinate." The Queen leaned forward slightly, clearly interested in the practical implications. "Can you give me an example of how these new protocols might work?" "Well, Your Majesty, we've established hand signals that guards can use to alert each other when civilian assistance is needed. We've also created a system where one guard can subtly guide lost children or distressed visitors toward help, while their partner maintains full security awareness. The key is that we're no longer pretending that the human needs around us don't exist. We're finding ways to address them that actually enhance rather than compromise our service." "And how have your fellow guards responded to these changes?" the Queen asked. James smiled, thinking of the conversations he'd had with his colleagues over the past weeks. "Initially, there was some resistance, Your Majesty. Change is always difficult, especially in an organization built on tradition. But once the guards understood that we were expanding our capabilities rather than abandoning our standards, most embraced the new approach enthusiastically. Many of them shared stories of times they had wanted to help someone but felt constrained by protocol." Margaret watched this exchange with obvious pride, seeing her son discuss complex policy matters with the sovereign as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She thought about the boy who had once been so shy he could barely order food at a restaurant, now confidently explaining his vision for military service to the Queen of England. The Queen rose from her chair and moved to an elegant side table, where several items were arranged. "Sergeant Mitchell, I have something for you." She returned with a small, leather-bound box that bore the royal coat of arms. James stood immediately, understanding the significance of what was happening. Inside the box was the Queen's Commendation for Brave Conduct, a rarely awarded decoration reserved for acts of exceptional courage or service that go beyond normal duties. "This commendation," the Queen explained as she pinned the medal to James's uniform, "is not just for the moment when you helped young Emma Thompson. It's for demonstrating that true service sometimes requires the courage to do what's right rather than what's expected. It's for showing that protocol and compassion are not enemies, but partners in meaningful service." James felt overwhelmed by the weight of the moment, not the physical weight of the medal, but the recognition of what his actions had meant. Your Majesty, I'm deeply honored, but I feel I should mention that I've received hundreds of letters from people around the world who were moved by what happened. The real reward has been learning that a simple act of kindness can inspire others to think differently about service and duty. Indeed, the Queen agreed. That's perhaps the most important aspect of what you've accomplished. You've reminded us all that the most powerful traditions are those that evolve to meet human needs, rather than existing for their own sake. As the formal part of their audience concluded, the Queen surprised both James and Margaret by suggesting they join her for tea. I'd very much like to hear more about your childhood, Sergeant, and about the values that shaped the man who could make such a consequential decision in such a brief moment. Over the next hour, in a setting that felt remarkably informal despite the royal surroundings, James found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone outside his immediate family. He spoke about growing up without a father, about watching his mother work multiple jobs while never complaining, about the day he had decided to join the military because he wanted to serve something greater than himself. Margaret, initially overwhelmed by the surreal nature of having tea with the Queen, gradually relaxed and shared her own perspectives on raising a child to understand service and sacrifice. She talked about teaching James that strength and kindness were not contradictory, qualities that real courage often meant doing the right thing when no one was watching. Mrs. Mitchell, the Queen said as their time together drew to a close, you've raised a son who understands that true nobility comes from how we treat those who need our help. That's a lesson that transcends rank, title, or station in life. They prepared to leave, the Queen walked them to the door personally, an unusual gesture that spoke to the genuine connection she felt with this mother and son from Manchester, who had reminded the monarchy of its highest purposes. Sergeant Mitchell, she said as they shook hands farewell, I hope you'll keep me informed of how your new protocols develop. I have a feeling that what began with one lost child may evolve into something that changes how we think about service throughout the military. James promised he would, understanding that this was not just politeness but a genuine royal interest in ensuring that the lessons of that morning 3 weeks ago would continue to ripple outward. As they walked back through the palace corridors, toward the outside world, Margaret linked her arm through her son's. James, she said quietly, I think your father would have been proud of the man you've become. It was the highest praise she could give, and James understood that this moment, walking through a royal palace with his mother after being personally honored by the Queen, was not really about him at all. It was about the power of choosing, compassion over convenience, of remembering that service means serving everyone who needs help, not just those whose needs fit neatly into established procedures. Mitchell found himself standing in an elegant reception room at St. James's Palace, wearing his finest dress uniform and feeling more nervous than he had ever felt during 23 years of military service. His mother, Margaret Mitchell, stood beside him in her best dress, one she had purchased specifically for this occasion after James had called to tell her about the royal invitation. Margaret was a small woman with weathered hands that spoke to decades of hard work, but her eyes sparkled with fierce pride as she took in the ornate surroundings. At 71, she had never imagined she would find herself in a royal palace, much less being honored for her son's service. The journey from their council estate in Manchester to this moment felt like something from a fairy tale. I still can't believe this is real, love, Margaret whispered to James as they waited with about 30 other military personnel and palace staff members who were being recognized for exceptional service. When you were a little boy getting into scraps with the neighborhood kids, I never thought you'd end up here. James smiled at his mother, remembering those childhood days when she had worked as a cleaner at the local hospital during the day and took in mending work at night to keep them afloat. She had always insisted that kindness was more important than toughness, that helping others was the highest calling anyone could have. In many ways, everything he had done 3 weeks ago had been a reflection of the values she had instilled in him. Neither did I, Mum, he admitted quietly. But I think you'd have done the same thing if you'd been in my position. Before Margaret could respond, a palace aide approached them with a warm smile. Sergeant Mitchell, Her Majesty is ready to see you now. The walk through the palace corridors felt both eternal and instantaneous. James had been in royal presence before during ceremonial occasions, but this was different, more personal, more meaningful. When they entered the private reception room where Queen Elizabeth II waited, James felt the full weight of the moment settle upon him. The Queen, elegant and composed as always, stood near a window that overlooked the palace gardens. She turned as they entered, and James was struck by the warmth in her eyes as she looked first at him, then at his mother. "Sergeant Mitchell," the Queen said, extending her hand. "I'm delighted to meet you properly at last. And this must be your mother, Mrs. Mitchell. I've heard wonderful things about you both." Margaret, who had practiced her curtsy dozens of times in James's small flat, executed it perfectly despite her obvious nervousness. "Your Majesty, it's the greatest honor of my life to meet you." "The pleasure is entirely mine," the Queen replied with genuine warmth. "I understand that you raised a son who knows the true meaning of service, not just to crown and country, but to any person in need of help." James felt his chest tighten with emotion as the Queen continued. "What you did 3 weeks ago, Sergeant, reminded us all of something very important. The crown exists to serve the people, not the other way around. When you helped that frightened child, you embodied the very best of what we hope the monarchy represents." The Queen gestured for them to sit in the comfortable chairs arranged near the window. This was clearly not going to be a formal, brief audience, but rather a genuine conversation. "I've read the reports of your actions," the Queen said, settling into her own chair with practiced grace. "But I'd very much like to hear the story from you directly. What was going through your mind during those crucial moments?" James had told this story many times over the past 3 weeks, to his commanding officers, to the reporters who had somehow tracked him down, to his fellow guards who wanted to understeer. 6 months after that rainy morning when James Mitchell had chosen compassion over protocol, the ripple effects of his decision continued to spread far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. The Emma protocols, as they had come to be known, among the guards were now standard operating procedure, not just for the Queen's Guard but for ceremonial units throughout the British military. James stood in the same courtyard where his life had changed, but now he wore the insignia of his new position as Special Liaison for Public Interaction. His role had evolved beyond anything anyone had initially imagined. He spent his days training new guards, developing emergency response procedures, and serving as a bridge between the rigid world of military protocol and the unpredictable needs of the public. The morning was crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight casting golden shadows across the palace grounds. James was conducting a training session with a group of newly assigned guards, teaching them the delicate balance between maintaining their ceremonial duties and responding to genuine emergencies. "Remember," he told the young soldiers gathered around him, "our primary responsibility is always security and dignity. But within those parameters we have more flexibility than previous generations of guards believed possible. The key is learning to read situations quickly and respond appropriately." Corporal Davies, who had been promoted and now served as James's assistant in developing the new protocols, raised his hand. "Sarge, what if we're not sure whether a situation requires intervention?" James smiled at the question he heard at least once in every training session. "When in doubt, err on the side of compassion. It's easier to explain why you helped someone who didn't absolutely need it than to explain why you ignored someone who genuinely did." As if summoned by their conversation about real-world applications, a familiar scene began to unfold near the palace gates. A small boy, perhaps 5 years old, had become separated from his school group during a field trip. The child stood crying near the fence while his teacher frantically searched the crowd of tourists, calling his name. "Perfect timing," James said to his trainees. "Davies, show them how it's done." The young corporal nodded and moved smoothly into position. Using the techniques they had developed over the past months, he made eye contact with the lost child while subtly signaling to his fellow guard. Within moments, they had established communication with both the boy and his teacher, facilitating a reunion without either guard leaving his post or compromising security. The watching trainees applauded as the relieved teacher led her student back to his classmates. It was a scene that had played out dozens of times since the new protocols had been implemented, each successful intervention reinforcing the value of what James had started. That, James told his students, is how we serve with both strength and compassion. Questions? A young guard raised her hand. Sir, do you ever regret what you did that day with the little girl? I mean, you could have been court-martialed instead of promoted. James considered the question, thinking about all the changes that single moment had brought to his life. I've never regretted helping Emma Thompson, he said finally. What I've learned is that sometimes the most dangerous thing we can do is follow rules so blindly that we forget why those rules exist in the first place. After the training session ended, James made his way to his office in the palace administrative wing, a space he still couldn't quite believe was his. The walls were covered with letters from people around the world who had been inspired by the story of the guard who chose compassion. There were drawings from children, thank you notes from parents, and formal commendations from military units in other countries who had implemented similar protocols. His assistant knocked on the door and entered with the day's correspondence. Among the usual administrative documents was a hand-delivered envelope that bore a familiar return address. The Thompson family from Scotland. James opened it to find a school photograph of Emma Thompson, now several months older and beaming at the camera. On the back, she had written in careful 7-year-old handwriting, "To my friend, the kind soldier. I told my class about you, and now they all want to be helpers too. Thank you for teaching me that being brave means helping people. Love, Emma." Attached to the photo was a note from Emma's mother. "Dear Sergeant Mitchell, Emma talks about you constantly and has decided she wants to join the military when she grows up, because soldiers help people who are scared. Thank you for being the kind of person who makes children believe in heroes. We'll be visiting London again this Christmas and hope we might see you then. With endless gratitude, the Thompson family." James pinned Emma's photo to the bulletin board beside his desk, next to similar photos and letters from other children, whose lives had been touched by the new approach to guard duty. Each image reminded him that their work was about more than protocol or tradition. It was about the kind of world they were creating for the next generation. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. His secretary announced that he had a visitor, Major Harrison, who, despite his earlier concerns about protocol violations, had become one of James's strongest supporters. "Afternoon, Sergeant," the major said as he entered, carrying a thick folder that James recognized as similar to the one that had changed his life months earlier. "I have some interesting news to share." James gestured for the major to take a seat, noting the barely contained excitement in his superior's demeanor. "Good news, I hope, sir?" "Better than good," Major Harrison replied, opening the folder to reveal a collection of official documents bearing various military and government seals. "The protocols you've developed here have attracted international attention. We've received requests for training assistance from ceremonial units in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several European nations. The Emma protocols are going global." James felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with the potential impact. "That's incredible, sir. Does this mean—" "It means you're being asked to lead an international task force on modernizing ceremonial military protocols while maintaining traditional standards. You'll be traveling extensively, working with guard units around the world, and basically exporting the compassionate approach you pioneered." The magnitude of what Major Harrison was describing left James momentarily speechless. The idea that his split-second decision to help a frightened child had evolved into something with global implications seemed almost impossible to comprehend. "There's more," the major continued, clearly enjoying the moment. "Her Majesty has personally approved this assignment and asked me to tell you that she considers this work a vital part of ensuring that the monarchy remains relevant and connected to the people it serves." As James processed this extraordinary turn of events, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the council estates of Manchester to the palaces of London, from a soldier trained to ignore civilians to an international expert on compassionate military service, the path had been unexpected but somehow inevitable. "Sir," James said finally, "when I helped Emma Thompson that morning, I thought I was just doing what any decent person would do. I never imagined it would lead to any of this. Major Harrison smiled and closed the folder. That's exactly why. It worked, Sergeant. You weren't trying to start a revolution or make a statement. You were just being human at a moment when humanity was needed. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. As evening settled over London and James prepared to leave his office, he took one last look at Emma Thompson's photograph. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to spread the message that strength and compassion were not opposites, but partners in true service. There would be international conferences, training programs, and countless opportunities to share what he had learned about choosing humanity over rigid adherence to rules. But tonight he would call his mother in Manchester and tell her about this latest development in his impossible journey. She would be proud, of course, but she would also remind him, as she had his entire life, that the most important victories are the quiet ones, the moments when we choose to help someone who needs it simply because it's the right thing to do. The little girl who had changed his life by asking for help had grown up to become a symbol of something larger. The idea that true service means serving everyone who needs it, that real strength includes the courage to be kind, and that the best traditions are those that evolve to meet human needs. As James walked through the palace gates where his transformation had begun, he carried with him not just the weight of new responsibilities, but the knowledge that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can have the largest consequences. Emma Thompson had asked for help finding her mother, and in the process, she had helped the entire world find a better way to balance duty with humanity.